In a quiet village surrounded by whispering forests and an ancient cemetery, there lived a poor orphan girl named Amara. Every morning, while other girls her age plaited their hair and giggled by the market, Amara walked alone toward the graveyard carrying a bucket of water and old rags. The villagers watched her with cold eyes. They called her cursed. They called her strange. Children threw stones at her back and sang cruel songs. Which girl, talking to the dead. Which girl, soon you'll lose your head. But Amara never turned around. She never cried where they could see. She simply walked on, her thin shoulders straight, her feet bare against the dusty path. The elders whispered that she was possessed. Even the wealthiest family in the land, whose daughter Chica was Amara's age, openly scorned her. No one understood why she wasted her youth among the dead, scrubbing moss from forgotten tombstones that belonged to strangers. Yet every evening, she would kneel in silence at one unmarked grave, her tears watering the soil, her hands trembling with secrets she never told. This particular grave was different from all the others. While Amara cleaned every tombstone with care, this unmarked mound received something more. She cleaned it with love. Her fingers traced the earth gently, as if touching the face of someone precious. The soil always seemed fresh despite being old, and the grass there grew greener than anywhere else in the cemetery. One night, a villager named Obi passed by on his way home from drinking palm wine. He swore he saw a faint glow rising from that exact spot where Amara always knelt. His hands shook as he stumbled backward. By morning, he had told everyone in the market. The rumors spread like wildfire. Perhaps Amara was not just strange. Perhaps she truly served the spirits. Perhaps she was summoning darkness upon them all. The women clutched their children closer when she passed. The men spat on the ground after she walked by. But Amara continued her ritual, unbothered by their fear and hatred, as if she knew something they did not. The village prepared for the grand festival of plenty, a celebration of the harvest season. Everywhere you looked, there was color and noise and laughter. The wealthy merchant family, who owned half the farmland in the region, flaunted their riches with pride. Chica, the merchant's daughter, wore golden jewelry that caught the sunlight and blinded the eyes of jealous girls. She walked through the market square like a queen, her chin lifted high, her smile sharp as a blade. People bowed and praised her beauty. They called her the jewel of the village. Meanwhile, Amara walked past unnoticed, carrying only her bucket and rags, heading once again toward the cemetery. Her dress was faded and torn at the hem. Her feet were cracked and dusty. Chica saw her and laughed loudly, so everyone could hear. "Look, the grave girl is going to dance with corpses while we feast with the living." The crowd erupted in laughter. But as Chica turned to leave, her foot caught on a stone and she stumbled forward, nearly falling. Chica's face turned red with fury and embarrassment. She whipped around and pointed a trembling finger at Amara. "She did this. She cursed me. Did you all see? She looked at me and I fell." The crowd gasped and stepped back from Amara. The village chief, an old man with a long gray beard, pushed through the people. His face was stern. He stood before Amara and looked down at her with disgust. "You bring shame to this village, girl. You spend your days among the dead like you belong with them. Now you dare to curse the daughter of our most honored family." Amara shook her head slowly. "I did nothing, great chief. I only walked past." But no one believed her. The chief raised his walking stick and struck the ground 3 times. "I warn you now, leave the dead alone or face banishment from this land." Amara bowed her head silently, her lips pressed tight. The crowd murmured in approval. But from the edge of the gathering, an elder woman named Mama Needy watched quietly, her eyes heavy with knowing. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the village celebrated with drums and dancing, Mama Needy found Amara sitting alone by the cemetery gate. The old woman sat down beside her without asking permission. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Mama Needy's voice came soft and low. "Child, the dead you serve will not stay silent forever." Amara looked up, surprised. Mama Needy's wrinkled face showed no judgment, only sadness. You think I did not see? You think I did not know? The old woman touched Amara's hand gently. Your destiny is tied to the grave you tend. The spirits are gathering strength. Amara's eyes filled with tears. Then why do they hate me so, Mama Needy? Why does the whole village turn against me when I have done nothing but honor the forgotten? Mama Needy sighed deeply and stood to leave. She looked back once, her voice carrying a weight of prophecy. Because they fear what you will one day reveal. That night, Amara could not sleep. Memories flooded her mind like a river breaking through a dam. She remembered herself as a small child, no more than 7 years old, running through fields of yam and cassava. Her father's laughter was loud and warm. Her mother's arms were soft and safe. They were humble farmers, but they were happy. Her father once worked for the wealthy merchant, the same man who was now Chica's father. He had been promised a piece of land for his years of loyal service. But when the time came, the merchant took the land for himself and gave her father nothing but insults. Her father tried to fight for justice, but who listens to a poor man against a rich one? Then one terrible night, fire came. Amara remembered the smell of smoke choking her lungs, the screams of her parents trapped inside their burning hut. She was outside fetching water when it happened. By the time she ran back, it was too late. The entire family was gone, except her. In the shadows of that memory, she saw him. Chica's father, standing at a distance, watching the flames with cold, empty eyes. Amara returned to the cemetery at midnight, when the moon hung low and pale in the sky. She poured water over the unmarked grave and sang softly, a lullaby her mother used to hum. The air grew heavy and still. Then the earth beneath her hands shuddered faintly, as if something below was stirring. A whisper escaped from the soil, soft as wind through dry leaves. Daughter, Amara froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Papa, she whispered back, her voice breaking. But there was no reply, only silence and the cold night air pressing against her skin. She collapsed onto the grave, sobbing into the dirt, her body shaking with grief she had buried for so long. I have not forgotten you, Papa. I will never forget. Unknown to her, a figure watched from behind a large tombstone. It was a jealous villager named Udoka, a man who hated Amara simply because she was different. His eyes narrowed with suspicion as he saw her speaking to the ground. By morning, he would make sure everyone knew. By the time the sun rose, the entire village was buzzing with the news. Udoka stood in the center of the market, his voice loud and dramatic. I saw her with my own eyes. She talks to the dead. She kneels and calls to them like they are her family. The crowd gasped and murmured. Mothers pulled their children behind them. The chief was summoned immediately. He arrived with his walking stick and a face like thunder. Chica stood beside him, her arms crossed, her smile smug and satisfied. I told you she was dangerous, Chica said sweetly. She will curse us all if you do not act. The chief raised his hand for silence. Amara must be cast out before she brings evil upon this land. But before anyone could move, Mama Needy stepped forward from the crowd. Her voice rang out clear and sharp. Drive her out, and the dead will drive you to your graves. The villagers froze. Even the chief hesitated. Mama Needy was the oldest living soul in the village, and her words carried the weight of ancient wisdom. No one dared to ignore her warnings. The chief cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Then what do you suggest, Mama Needy? How do we know she is not cursed? The old woman's eyes swept over the crowd. Let her prove herself. Let her swear before the ancestors at the sacred river. If she is pure, the waters will accept her. If she is cursed, the river will reject her. The crowd murmured in agreement. It was the old way, the way of testing truth. The chief nodded slowly. So be it. Tomorrow at dawn, Amara will face the test by water. Amara stood silent and calm, though her heart pounded in her chest. She nodded once. I accept. Chica leaned close to her father and whispered with a wicked smile. Now she will drown, and we will finally be rid of her. Her father said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Somewhere deep inside, guilt was beginning to gnaw at him like a rat in the walls. At dawn, The entire village gathered by the sacred river. The water was dark and still, reflecting the gray sky above. The chief stood at the edge with his arms raised. Amara stepped forward. She walked slowly through the crowd. No one touched her. No one spoke. She reached the riverbank and removed her old wrapper, standing in a simple white cloth. Without hesitation, she stepped into the water. The villagers held their breath, waiting for her to sink, waiting for the river to swallow her whole as proof of her curse. But instead, the waters rippled gently around her feet. They carried her forward softly, as if welcoming an old friend. A white heron appeared from nowhere and landed on a rock beside her, its wings glowing in the early light. The crowd gasped. A white heron was an omen of purity, a sign from the ancestors themselves. Amara stepped back onto the shore, dripping but unharmed. The villagers stared in shock. But Chica screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. It was a trick. She used witchcraft to fool the river. Chica's hatred for Amara grew like poison in her veins. She could not bear the thought that this poor, lowly girl had passed the test while she, the wealthy merchant's daughter, stood humiliated. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Chica wrapped herself in a dark cloak and crept toward the cemetery. Her plan was simple. She would desecrate the grave that Amara tended so carefully. She would dig it up, scatter the bones, and destroy whatever power Amara claimed to have. The moon was hidden behind clouds as she knelt before the unmarked mound. She raised a stick and began to scrape at the soil. But the moment her fingers touched the earth, the ground beneath her hands grew hot. She gasped and pulled back. Then, in the darkness, she saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, rising slowly from the soil as if reaching for her throat. Chica screamed and stumbled backward, falling hard on the ground. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it would burst. She did not stop running until she reached her father's house. After that night, strange things began to happen in the village. Livestock vanished without a trace. Goats that were tied securely in the evening were gone by morning. Chickens disappeared from their coops, leaving only feathers and silence. At night, the wind wailed through the streets like a chorus of the grieving dead. Shadows gathered near the cemetery, moving in ways that shadows should not move. The elders met in secret and whispered nervously among themselves. "The dead are restless," one of them said. "Something has disturbed them." Another elder shook his head. "It is not something, it is someone." They all knew who he meant. Mama Needy stood before them, her face grave and lined with worry. "The truth that was buried will not stay buried," she said slowly. "The spirits are waking because justice has been denied too long." The elders exchanged fearful glances. They had lived through many seasons, but never had they felt the presence of the dead so strongly. The air itself felt heavy with their anger. One afternoon, Amara stood outside the merchant's grand house. She did not knock. She simply waited. Eventually, Chica's father emerged, his face pale and drawn. He had not been sleeping well. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes like bruises. "What do you want, girl?" he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual strength. Amara looked at him steadily. "I want nothing from you, sir. I only want you to remember." His jaw clenched. "Remember what?" "The fire," she said softly. "The night my family burned." His face went white. "I had nothing to do with that." "You know that is a lie," Amara said, her voice calm but cutting. "And so do the dead." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing frozen in his doorway. That night, alone in his room, the merchant heard voices calling his name. They came from the direction of the graveyard, thin and distant but unmistakable. He covered his ears, but the voices only grew louder. His health began to fail. He saw visions of fire in his sleep, felt the heat of flames on his skin. And in his nightmares, he muttered over and over, "We buried it. We buried it deep." Amara sat alone in the cemetery, holding something small and blackened in her hand. It was a charred trinket, a small wooden carving of a bird that her father had made for her when she was a child. She had found it buried near the unmarked grave, hidden beneath years of soil and rain. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched it to her chest. The memories came flooding back with painful clarity. She remembered the merchant's men arriving at their small farm in the dead of night. She remembered her father arguing, her mother pleading. She remembered the smell of oil being poured, the sound of a match being struck. The merchant had orchestrated the fire that killed her parents. He had stolen their farmland and buried the truth along with their bodies. Her father had been laid to rest in an unmarked grave, without honor, without justice, because no one dared to stand against the merchant's power. But Amara had never stopped honoring him. Every day, she cleaned his grave. Every evening, she wept for him. And now, the spirits were beginning to remember too. Amara no longer hid her devotion. She sang openly at her father's grave, her voice rising clear and strong into the evening air. And this time, something else happened. The other graves around her began to tremble faintly, as if the earth itself was stirring. Villagers who were passing by stopped and stared in fear. The ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with a low, deep vibration. Mama Needy stood at the cemetery gate, watching with solemn eyes. She turned to the frightened villagers and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. The sins of the living awaken the voices of the dead. What was buried in darkness will rise into light. The sky above them began to darken. Thick clouds rolled in from the horizon, swirling and heavy. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer with each passing moment. The villagers looked at one another nervously. Something was coming. Something old and powerful and impossible to stop. The storm was gathering, and it would not pass until justice was served. Chica was terrified. She had not slept properly in days. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that skeletal hand reaching up from the grave. She begged her father to do something, anything, to stop Amara. She is bringing a curse upon us, Father. You must silence her before it is too late. The merchant, desperate and half-mad with guilt and fear, paid a group of rough men to seize Amara and cast her into the forest where wild animals roamed. That evening, as Amara was walking home from the cemetery, the men grabbed her. She struggled, but they were too strong. They dragged her toward the edge of the village, her feet scraping against the dirt. But just as they reached the forest boundary, the sky exploded with light. A bolt of lightning struck the cemetery with a deafening crack, splitting a massive old tree down the center. The men froze in terror and dropped Amara to the ground. Villagers came running toward the sound, their faces pale with shock. And when they reached the cemetery, they saw what the lightning had revealed. Beneath the split tree, buried deep in the earth, were bones. Human bones, chained together. The villagers gathered around the unearthed remains, their faces twisted in horror and disbelief. The bones were old but unmistakable. These were not the remains of one person. There were many. Men, women, perhaps even children, all chained together and buried in secret. Whispers of betrayal spread through the crowd like wildfire. Who did this? Whose bones are these? Mama Needy stepped forward, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. She pointed at the merchant, who stood trembling at the back of the crowd. These bones were not hers to bury, she declared. These are the souls of those who stood against injustice and were silenced for it. The merchant tried to speak, his voice shaking. This is not my doing. It must be her. The grave girl brought this curse upon us. But the villagers were no longer listening to him. They had seen too much. They had felt the weight of the truth pressing down on them. Mama Needy's voice rang out again. The dead do not lie, and tonight they will speak. That night, thunder shook the land so violently that the walls of houses trembled and cracks appeared in the earth. The sky turned black as ink, and the wind howled like 1,000 voices crying out in pain. Then, from the cemetery, figures began to appear. They were made of light and shadow, translucent and glowing faintly in the darkness. The spirits of the wronged dead rose from their graves, their faces filled with sorrow and rage. They moved silently through the village, their bony fingers pointing toward the merchant's house. Villagers screamed and fell to their knees, covering their faces and begging for mercy. Children cried and clung to their mothers. Even the bravest men trembled like leaves in the wind. The spirits surrounded the merchant and his family, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire. Chica collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. Please, please forgive us. We did not know. We did not mean it. But the spirits did not speak. They only pointed, and the earth beneath the merchant's feet began to crack open. The merchant let out a terrible scream as the ground split beneath him. His wealth, his gold, his fine clothes, all of it scattered into the wind like ashes, as if they had never existed at all. He fell to his knees, clawing at the dirt, but there was nothing left to hold on to. Chica tried to run, but her feet would not move. She looked down in terror and saw the soil slowly swallowing her ankles, pulling her down inch by inch. "Help me!" she screamed, reaching out desperately. Amara stood watching from a distance, her heart torn between justice and mercy. She ran forward and grabbed Chica's hands, trying to pull her free. But the spirits were stronger. They dragged Chica deeper into the earth, her screams fading until there was only silence. The merchant collapsed, lifeless, his eyes frozen open in terror. The storm began to calm. The spirits slowly faded back into the ground, their work complete. And as the first light of dawn broke over the village, everything was still. The reckoning was over. The villagers stood in silence, their faces pale and haunted. No one spoke. No one moved. They had witnessed something beyond their understanding, something that would be remembered for generations. Slowly, they turned to look at Amara, who stood alone in the center of the cemetery, her face calm and peaceful. Mama Needy stepped forward and bowed her head in respect. "Forgive us, child. We did not see the truth. We did not honor your devotion." One by one, the villagers came forward and knelt before her, asking for forgiveness. They realized now that Amara's devotion had never been witchcraft. It had been love. It had been honor. It had been the purest form of remembrance. The unmarked grave of her father was given a proper tombstone, carved with his name and the words, "A man of truth, betrayed but not forgotten." Amara became the guardian of the cemetery, respected and honored by all. And every evening, she still knelt by her father's grave, but now she smiled. She spoke the final words softly for all to hear. "The dead do not forget. Deeds, whether kind or cruel, will always rise from the grave to judge the living." The village rebuilt itself slowly, like a body healing from a deep wound. The merchant's house stood empty now, its doors and windows boarded shut. No one dared to enter. It was said that at night, you could still hear voices inside, the whispers of guilt and regret that would never fade. The farmland that had once belonged to Amara's family was returned to her by the elders. It was the least they could do. She did not farm it herself, but she allowed the poorest families in the village to use it freely, asking for nothing in return. Her kindness became legend. People began to travel from neighboring villages just to hear her story. They wanted to know how a girl, so young and so broken, had remained strong in the face of such cruelty. Amara would smile gently and say, "I was never alone. The dead kept me company. They reminded me that truth does not die, even when it is buried." And the children who once threw stones at her now brought her flowers and sat at her feet, listening to her speak about honor, memory, and justice. Mama Needy grew older, her body weaker, but her spirit remained sharp as ever. One evening, she sat with Amara under the shade of a great tree near the cemetery. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "You have done well, child," Mama Needy said softly. "Your father would be proud." Amara smiled, though her eyes glistened with tears. "I only did what my heart told me to do." Mama Needy nodded. "That is the hardest thing of all, to follow your heart when the world tells you to forget, to move on, to let the past stay buried." She paused, gazing out at the graves. "But you understood something the rest of us have forgotten. The past is not something to fear or hide. It is something to honor, because without it, we do not know who we are." Amara took the old woman's hand and squeezed it gently. They sat in silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, like the souls of the forgotten lighting up the night sky. Years passed. Amara grew into a woman of quiet strength and deep wisdom. She never married, though many men asked. She said the cemetery was her family, and the spirits were her companions. She taught the young girls of the village to read and write, something her own mother had once taught her. She told them stories of bravery, of standing for truth even when the cost was high. And she made sure that every grave in the cemetery, no matter how old or forgotten, was cleaned and honored. One day, a traveler came to the village. He was a storyteller, a man who wandered from town to town collecting tales to share. When he heard about Amara, he begged to meet her. She agreed, and they sat together for hours as she told him everything. The fire, the betrayal, the grave, the spirits, the reckoning. When she finished, the storyteller had tears in his eyes. "This is a story the world needs to hear," he said. And so he carried it with him, telling it in every village he visited. And that is how Amara's story spread far beyond her small village, becoming a legend that would never die. One quiet evening, many years later, Amara felt a strange pull in her chest. She walked to the cemetery as she always did, but this time, something was different. The air felt lighter. The wind carried a warmth she had not felt in years. She knelt by her father's grave and closed her eyes. And then she heard it, his voice, clear and strong, no longer a whisper rising from the earth, but a voice filled with love and peace. "Well done, my daughter. You kept your promise. You honored me when the world forgot. Now, it is time for you to rest." Amara smiled, tears streaming down her face. She lay down gently on the grass beside the grave, her hand resting on the cool stone. And as the sun set and the stars began to glow, her breathing slowed. The villagers found her the next morning, peaceful and still, a soft smile on her lips. They buried her beside her father, and on her tombstone, they carved these words: "She loved the forgotten, and in doing so, was never forgotten." The village never forgot Amara. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, the people gathered at the cemetery to honor her memory. They cleaned the graves, sang songs, and told her story to the children. The cemetery, once a place of fear and sorrow, became a place of peace and reflection. And the lesson Amara taught them echoed through the generations. The dead do not forget. What you do in secret, whether cruel or kind, will one day rise to the surface. The graves hold not just bones, but truth. And truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way into the light. So remember this, dear listener. Treat the living with kindness. Honor the dead with respect. For the deeds you sow today will be the harvest that greets you tomorrow. And you, what lesson do you take from this story?